King Philip II burst into his son's bedroom, not like a father, but like a soldier. He wore full battle armor, as if going to war. Prince Don Carlos, who was supposed to rule the biggest empire in the world one day, woke up in shock. His room was full of armed guards, and leading them was his own father. The king's face looked cold and serious. You couldn't even see his eyes behind the metal helmet. In that scary moment, Don Carlos realized something terrible. This wasn't just a warning. This wasn't just a punishment. He was being arrested. The same man who gave him life had come to take away his freedom. The king was no longer a father. He was now a ruler doing his duty, even if it meant breaking his own son's heart. This shocking moment would be whispered about in royal courts all across Europe. But how did things get this bad? Why would a king lock up his only son? To understand that, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the day a prince was born. Some called it a gift from God. Others believed it was a hidden curse. Before we start this incredible story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. It's the best way to join us as we explore more dark and forgotten stories from the past. Before Don Carlos ever took a breath, he was already a prisoner of his own blood. The year was 1545, and in the Spanish royal palace, courtiers whispered excitedly about the coming heir. But behind closed doors, the royal physicians exchanged worried glances. They understood something the celebrating nobles didn't. This child was the product of a bloodline so intertwined, so obsessively pure, that it had become poison. Here's what pure meant to the Habsburgs. Carlos had 6 great-great-grandparents. Just 6. A normal person has 16. Think about that for a moment. 10 of his ancestors had been erased through generations of uncles marrying nieces, of first cousins, wedding first cousins, all in the name of keeping the crown's blood untainted by outsiders. The family tree wasn't branching, it was strangling itself. The court scribes recorded his birth with flourishing quills and golden ink, but they couldn't record the invisible damage coded into his very cells. When Carlos finally emerged into the world on July 8, 1545, the midwives noticed his head seemed oddly shaped, his cries weaker than they should be. But he was alive, and he was male, and that was enough for celebration. His mother, Maria Manuela of Portugal, held him exactly once. She was barely 17, exhausted from a brutal delivery that had torn her body apart from the inside. The fever set in within hours. While the court celebrated the birth of an heir, Maria's skin burned like parchment. She whispered prayers in Portuguese, her homeland's language, as her ladies-in-waiting pressed cold cloths to her forehead. 4 days, that's all she got. 4 days to be a mother before the infection claimed her. The same bells that had rung for Carlos's birth now tolled for Maria's funeral. The infant prince, swaddled in silk and ignorant of his loss, had cost his mother her life before he could even focus his eyes enough to see her face. And here's where it gets truly dark. Maria wasn't just Carlos's mother. She was also his first cousin. Their fathers were brothers. Their mothers were sisters. This wasn't just a marriage, it was a genetic echo chamber. The same blood that had killed Maria now flowed through Carlos, carrying with it generations of accumulated damage. King Philip, barely 20 years old himself, stood at his wife's funeral, holding his infant son. The courtiers saw a grieving widower hour with his heir. But Philip saw something else in that moment. He saw the price of purity. His son had survived, yes, but at what cost? And more terrifying still, what invisible costs were yet to be paid? The woe. Nurses reported troubling things. The baby's feeding was erratic. His sleep patterns were chaotic. He would scream for hours without cause, then fall into deathly silent stupors that terrified the servants. One nurse swore she saw him stop breathing entirely for nearly a minute before gasping back to life like a drowning man breaking the surface. But infant troubles were common in royal nurseries. The court physicians assured Philip that the boy would grow strong. After all, he carried the blood of emperors, of conquistadors, who had claimed half the world for Spain. Surely that legacy would manifest in greatness. They had no idea how wrong they were. The blood of emperors was exactly the problem. Each generation of intermarriage had been like adding another link to an invisible chain, and Carlos was wearing all of them. The Habsburg jaw, that famous deformity, was just the visible sign of deeper damage. What lurked beneath would be far worse. The curse wasn't mystical, it was mathematical. Genetic roulette played with increasingly terrible odds, and Carlos had lost that game before he ever had a chance to play. Every cell in his body carried the accumulated mistakes of his ancestors' pride, their obsession with keeping power within the family at any cost. He had survived his birth, a motherless prince born into a genetic cage. But the curse of his blood wasn't just a number in a family tree. Soon it would become visible for the whole world to see, etched into his very bones. The royal armorer was sweating. The breastplate forged from the finest Milan steel simply wouldn't fit. He'd measured the Prince of Aureus 3 times, each measurement more puzzling than the last. The left side of the prince's torso curved inward where it should expand. The right shoulder sat higher than the left by nearly 2 in. No amount of hammering or reshaping could make standard armor work on this 13-year-old body that defied symmetry. Carlos stood there, arms outstretched as the armorer struggled. The prince's breathing came in short, sharp bursts, not from exertion, but because his sunken chest couldn't fully expand. Every breath was a battle his malformed ribcage fought against his lungs. The court pretended not to notice, but Carlos heard their whispers echo off the stone walls. The physical evidence of his cursed bloodline was becoming impossible to hide. His skull had grown asymmetrically, bulging on one side like a melon left too long in the sun. Palace portraits required increasingly creative angles to disguise it. His left leg had stopped growing at the same rate as his right, forcing him to walk with an odd lurching gait that clicked and scraped across the marble floors. But here's the thing about divine right. It assumes divine perfection. In 16th century Spain, the king's body was considered a reflection of God's favor. A strong symmetrical heir proved heaven's blessing on the royal line. But what did Carlos's twisted form say about the Habsburgs? What did it say about Spain itself? The court physicians developed elaborate explanations. The prince's humors were unbalanced. His stars were misaligned at birth. Anything but the truth that generations of Habsburg inbreeding had finally produced its inevitable result. They prescribed treatments that sound like torture today. Bleeding to balance his humors, mercury baths to straighten his spine, specially crafted iron boots to force his shorter leg to stretch. Carlos endured it all with a fury that made servants flee his presence. When the metal boots came off each night, you could hear his screams echoing through the palace corridors, not just from pain but from rage at his own body's betrayal. He was supposed to be perfect. He was supposed to be king. The royal tutors reported even more troubling signs. The prince's attention wandered constantly. He would fixate on strange details. The pate, urn of cracks in the ceiling, the sound of his own breathing while ignoring vital lessons in statecraft. His speech came in rapid bursts, or not at all. Some days he spoke with the eloquence expected of royalty. Other days he could barely form coherent sentences, his tongue seeming to trip over itself. And then there were the headaches, crushing, world-ending headaches that sent him to his chambers for days at a time. The servants would hear him pounding his malformed skull against the stone walls, trying to drive out the pain through more pain. When he emerged, his eyes would be bloodshot, unfocused, like he was seeing through our world into some terrible other place. The marriage proposals started arriving when Carlos turned 14. Royal families across Europe sent portraits of their daughters, each seeking alliance with Spain's vast empire. But Philip delayed, deflected, made excuses. How could he send honest descriptions of his son to potential brides? How could he explain that the heir to the throne couldn't stand straight, couldn't breathe properly, couldn't even wear armor like a true Spanish prince? The foreign ambassadors who met Carlos sent coded messages back to their courts. The prince shows signs of weakness, they wrote carefully. His constitution appears delicate. They didn't dare write the truth. That the heir to the Spanish throne looked like something broken and reassembled wrong, like a porcelain doll shattered and glued back together by a blind craftsman. The servants had their own whispered theories. Some said the ghost of his mother haunted his twisted bones, punishment for the unnatural union that created him. Others claimed you could see the sins of his ancestors written in his flesh. Each deformity a generation's worth of pride made manifest. But the deformities on the outside were nothing compared to the darkness taking root on the inside. A monstrous cruelty was growing in the young prince, and it was about to reveal itself in the most grotesque way imaginable. The royal shoemaker presented the Boots, trembling. He had made a mistake, and he had no idea his punishment would be to cut them up and eat them. It started as an ordinary fitting in Carlos's chambers. The craftsman had labored for weeks on these boots, specially designed to accommodate the prince's shorter leg. But when Carlos tried them on, the left boot pinched just slightly, just enough to send him into a rage that transformed the elegant chamber into a theater of humiliation. "Eat them," Carlos commanded, his voice eerily calm. The shoemaker laughed nervously, certain he'd misheard. But the prince's eyes, those bloodshot, unfocused eyes, held no humor. "Cut them into pieces and eat them." Now the court watched in horrified silence as the shoemaker, tears streaming down his face, took his own crafting knife to the leather. The sound of cutting filled the room, slow, deliberate slices through material he'd spent weeks perfecting. Then came the worst sound, chewing. The forced rhythmic crunch of a man eating his own livelihood while a 17-year-old prince watched with satisfaction. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was a pattern. The palace kitchens told stories that made seasoned soldiers blanch. Carlos had developed a fascination with watching animals die. Not hunting, which was noble, not even butchering, which was necessary. He wanted to see suffering. He would order live rabbits brought to his chambers, then roast them alive over his fireplace, timing how long their screams lasted. The servants tasked with cleaning his rooms would find the charred remains arranged in careful patterns like some grotesque art. One young page made the mistake of laughing at the prince's limp. Carlos heard it. He always heard the mockery, real or imagined. That night, the boy woke to find the prince standing over his bed with a poker from the fireplace, glowing orange, and the darkness. The only thing that saved him was Carlos's own malformed body betraying him. He swung the poker but lost his balance, giving the page time to flee, screaming into the corridor. The violence was becoming harder to contain. During a meeting with Portuguese dignitaries, Carlos suddenly grabbed a knife from the dinner table and held it to an ambassador's throat, demanding he admit that Portugal was inferior to Spain. The man's careful diplomatic training crumbled as he felt the blade press against his skin, saw the wild excitement in the prince's eyes. King Philip had to personally intervene, gently talking his son into lowering the weapon like one might coax a rabid dog. But what terrified the court most wasn't the violence itself, it was the intelligence behind it. Carlos wasn't simply mad, he was cunning in his cruelty. He knew exactly who he could torment without consequence. He targeted servants, craftsmen, anyone without the political power to resist. When high-ranking nobles were present, he could play the part of a troubled but manageable prince. The moment they left, the mask dropped. The court physicians offered their explanations. The prince's unbalanced humors caused excessive choler. His deformed skull put pressure on his brain, creating violent impulses. But privately, even they wondered if something darker was at work. Was this madness born from his physical condition? Or was it something else, a fundamental evil that would have existed even in a perfect body? His father, Philippe, tried everything. Priests were brought in to pray over Carlos. The finest minds in Europe were consulted. Elaborate routines were established to manage the prince's worst impulses, but nothing worked. If anything, the attempts to control him only made him more creative in his cruelty. The servants developed an elaborate warning system. When Carlos's footsteps echoed through the corridors, that distinctive lurching gate word spread like wildfire. Chambermaid. They would abandon their duties. Kitchen boys would hide in pantries. Even the guards would find urgent business elsewhere. The heir to the throne had become a monster everyone fled from. A prince this unstable was a threat, but he could be managed, contained. That is, until his own father delivered a psychological blow so personal, so deeply humiliating it would ignite Carlos's rage into an inferno. Every man in the Spanish court looked at the new queen, Elizabeth of Valois, with admiration. But Prince Carlos looked at her with something else, the burning resentment of a man looking at what was stolen from him. The betrayal had been a masterpiece of political maneuvering. Originally, Elizabeth had been promised to Carlos as part of a peace treaty between Spain and France. For months, the young prince had pored over her portrait, memorizing every detail of the beautiful French princess who would be his wife. For the first time in his twisted life, something pure had been offered to him.